the then Communities Secretary Eric Pickles failed to act on the 2013 recommendation to tighten up fire safety regulations after a similar cladding fire at a place called Lakanal House, another London council block, where it killed 6 people. Morbick says it was not, quote, treated with any sense of urgency, and indeed criticises more widely, and I think this is quite interesting for current politics, criticises more widely you remember, Emily, the thing that David Cameron talked about in the early part of his government, the bonfire of regulation, this idea that, you'd have one regulation in and one regulation out, and that was the government rule. And Eric Pickles in particular, who comes out pretty badly in this report, Pickles in particular sort of took to that with aplomb, and he really wanted to kind of drive it through the Department of Communities and Local Government. It's a reminder that, regulation cannot be viewed in that way. If something needs to be regulated, then it needs to be regulated, not that somehow that negates some other regulation elsewhere. The key is to have good regulation, and you wouldn't know that necessarily, and properly enforced, and you wouldn't know that necessarily even from the way we talk about it in our current politics, or even in the current Tory leadership campaign. I was watching James Cleverly's speech the other day, a politician who I think it has a lot to say in some ways, but he was talking about that bonfire of regulation then and saying, actually, we need to step it up. That actually, I can't remember what he said, but actually we need 2 regulations out for everyone in, or 3. This is the most sort of facile way of seeing regulation. If we have learned nothing from Grenfell, it is to think that somehow regulation in and of itself is bad. You can have bad regulation, and we should get rid of it, but it's not an inherent problem, indeed far from it.
It's a bit like the way people treat health and safety as a parodic phrase. Like, health and safety means, nobody's allowed a Christmas tree at Christmas. It doesn't actually. Health and safety is probably what previous tragedies have decreed could stop future tragedies. And yet we've sort of had this response to anything health and safety as being sort of, that's not much fun. That's not going to help Britain grow. When actually you look at what this has meant in real terms, which is people ignoring things that they knew about, people ignoring things that would have cost pennies more to make better and not doing anything about it. And I mean, Theresa May says there, doesn't she? We will get to the bottom of it. That was 7 years ago. We've had 4 prime ministers since then. We had a fire last month in Dagenham. We've got a fire going on now as we speak in another high-rise block. So you do have to kind of say, at what point does the priority of things that people actually warned about become too big to ignore?
Well, the problem is, because it was ignored for so long, and because so many of these companies were allowed to, and councils were allowed to install things they never should have done, the problem has become more expensive than it would have been if we dealt with it in the first place, if we'd had better regulation in the first place and spent, as you were putting to May, slightly more money then. Because guess what? Once you build a building, it's really much more difficult, more expensive to retrofit it or solve it after construction. I mean, there's enough to sort of digest and think about and talk about with Grenfell itself and the tragedy there. But of course, it ended up spawning so many other stories because Grenfell itself had a profound effect on Britain and British housing in 2 ways. One, obviously, they then became aware very quickly, or people started to worry very quickly, about the same cladding that had been used on Grenfell or similar type products being used on other tower blocks. And obviously lots of people rightly and totally understandably concerned about it, not wanting to live there, wanting to see remediation. That itself has taken many years. We learned that the government actually, again, the sort of shocking failure of kind of regulation and local government, often didn't even know which buildings had these materials on them, so had to do all these complicated assessments, and that took years and cost loads of money. That process is still ongoing. In a sense, some of these buildings still have that cladding. It's cost billions to try and remediate. But then there was this other effect which sort of unfolded in the years since, and I covered quite a lot on Newsnight, which was about building safety in general, which is that new builds, and I'm talking, for the last 20 years or so, often leasehold flats in cities, suddenly found, or there was a concern that some of the materials and the way that they had been constructed were dangerous, particularly with regards to fire safety. Literally, potentially millions of people living in buildings that either were considered not truly fire safe, and that is worrying in and of itself, but also potentially, well, not even potentially, actually unmortgageable, unsellable, because banks would not cover or would not be willing to actually cover mortgages on these properties because they were afraid that they would end up in smoke. Whether that was right or wrong, that was the impression. So government ended up, basically you had millions of people suffering what always seemed to me to be the biggest injustice, that they had bought these flats, often flats, in good faith. They had got mortgages on them. They had scraped and saved to do everything that they could, do the thing that government always tells them to do, to get a home of their own, often shared ownership as well, by the way. And yet then were turned around and told that not only were their buildings potentially unsafe in a way that they could never have foreseen, but also they could never sell them.
Yeah. They were absolutely trapped.
Trapped.
Within, I mean, not physically trapped, but trapped economically in a product that was no longer considered sellable.
Yeah, exactly. And the government's response to that over a long period. I mean, there have been lots of reporting on this by lots of other people as well, and there's been loads and loads of campaigns. But it is still a work in progress. And even now, many people are still in a situation where they're awaiting remediation for these building safety problems, which go beyond fire, by the way. In some cases, there probably was an overreaction, right?
That's the trouble, isn't it?
Yeah.
That everyone feels unsafe. And then, of course, all insurance companies are saying, well, we don't know about this, so maybe we better not. And then you're stuck in this new trap, whether or not it is truly dangerous.
Exactly right. So you ended up in a situation where banks started to get really skittish over potentially things that were not that problematic. It wasn't about, say, cladding, for example, that was highly flammable. It might be that there wasn't, sort of, as I say, proper insulation, or there weren't fire safety walls, or it might be that the balcony was not in the right material. So it was everything from potentially really serious to potentially not so serious. But what Grenfell did is highlight something that everyone in the industry and the government knew, but we all didn't know, the public didn't know, and the banks didn't know, or said that they didn't know, is that there was a real deficiency in the building safety regulations and regime. And that's the point. If suddenly, that's the whole point of having a regulatory regime, right? It's a bit like food. We all go to the supermarket, right? And we eat the food that's in the supermarket.
Because we trust that it's come from the right place.
Exactly, even though we don't actually know the provenance or what's in it or whatever. But
whether
we
it's
trust,
horse.
Yeah, indeed. But we trust, broadly speaking, that the regulatory regime is decent enough that it's going to be safe.
Yeah.
Might not always be, but broadly speaking. That was the case, wrongly, about the building regime. But as soon as you lose confidence in it, that's it.
Everything else
Confidence drains from everything. And that is what these millions of people have been left with, and it still hasn't been resolved. Well, someone who's experienced this firsthand is Sophie Bichener. And she is a campaigner with the organisation End Our Cladding Scandal. Sophie, thanks so much for being with us today. Are you, I suppose, just your reaction to the report, first of all? Obviously, you weren't directly connected with Grenfell, but in so many ways, the experience of you and so many others have been connected to it deeply. What's your reaction to the report?
It's been a long time coming, and it's a nerve-wracking and, I guess, stressful day for everybody who's been in or has ever been living in a building that is still covered in flammable cladding. The Grenfell Inquiry should be like a landmark case and a landmark report. The government should commit to implementing every single one of the findings. It is really distressing, not only thinking about Grenfell and thinking about what happened, but also thinking about how there hasn't really been any justice to this point, and nobody has been held accountable for what happened on that night. And
just tell us about your own experience in terms of where you live and the sort of how you've got to the point that you're at now.
Yeah, so I also live in a building that has flammable cladding, potentially flammable insulation, and missing fire breaks. We found out around 2019, so a couple of years after the Grenfell Tower disaster, that it was a dangerous building. We've just started the remediation of the building. It's taken obviously 7 years to get to this point. It still has flammable material surrounding it, so in a similar way to the Dagenham building, kind of still at risk. And yeah, it's been a long 7 years. Like me and hundreds of thousands of other people in the country are still living in these buildings and still having to think about going to sleep at night in a potentially unsafe home.
It's properly sort of economic captivity in that sense, isn't it? You are stuck. Did you ever get to the bottom of whether the company that put the cladding on your building knew whether it was a risky material?
We haven't got that far at all. I think actually we don't really know what the material is. We just know that it's not of a non-combustible material.
In other words, it could be equally dangerous.
Yes, yeah, it could. And in all of these cases, all of the thousands of buildings that are still covered in this material, it isn't just the fact that that material is not safe, but it's kind of who put that on, who decided that it should go on buildings, did they know? But then also, how did they get planning permission? How did the building get reviewed? all of these factors still surprise me and surprise anybody that I speak to about the building safety crisis of how has this happened. And I think that's where it kind of goes back to this Grenfell report of it is a complete mix of failure across the board, from successive governments, from developers, from architects. Everybody has been able to cut corners in order to make profit. And it's people like me and horrifically the people that lost their lives that night that have had to suffer.
And Sophie, to be clear, when you talk about £200,000, I mean, this is how I initially got interested in this story when I started hearing about these bills that started landing on people's doormats. This was £200,000 per person, right? And that was not uncommon in terms of the people that you represent. Not uncommon at all. And indeed, some people have faced bankruptcy as a result.
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all. Most people that you speak to that live in a flammable home will see not only costs that come through to take the materials off the building, but also up to kind of 300% increases in insurance costs because you're living in an unsafe building. There's waking watch costs, so the costs of having people patrolling your building at all times of the night to make sure that it doesn't set on fire. There's new sprinklers, there's new fire doors, there's fire door checks every quarter that come, there's building safety reports. So all of these costs just keep coming, and that's kind of outside of that £200,000 of physically removing the materials. It's built up essentially like another level of service charges that have come to leaseholders.
And what is the latest you've heard from the government about all of these? Obviously, you've got the new government now, but the government and the last government in terms of meeting those costs and what they'll pay for?
I think obviously the new government have come in and have agreed to kind of review the situation as it stands at the moment. That is really pressing to us. Like, our homes must be made safe and the people who are responsible should pay. We haven't heard anything more in terms of the costs that come down to leaseholders. There's still a lot of confusion around whether a leaseholder qualifies for government support or whether they don't, and there's kind of lines drawn in the sand there that are really unfair. So End Our Cladding Scandal have been pushing the new government in a similar way to the way that we were with the old government to review these, and now, in light of obviously the Grenfell report as well, adding kind of pressure to this situation, like, how are we going to make these homes safe now and also make sure that people aren't financially bankrupted by making something that they bought in good faith, not knowing it was unsafe, not knowing how dangerous it was, to be able to put it right.
I mean, suddenly you realise what is coming at this government, right?
Yeah.
It is facing the kind of bills that it cannot even begin to imagine of people like Sophie, who are, nearly 10 years on, billions, still living in absolute sort of fear of what could happen and the cost of what is happening. You've got the survivors of Grenfell who are absolutely beside themselves with anger, having now had this written down, spoken out loud, that every single one of these deaths was avoidable, and the finger is being pointed at the corporations, at government failure, at corporate greed. And I guess if you're Starmer now, you say, well, is this at the top of the inbox now? Is this, he's spent the whole of PMQs talking about the £22 million black hole. They don't have the money to do the things that they wanted to do before any of this became absolutely, unignorable. So what happens now?
Problem is that whichever way you cut it, and whichever way, however you think about the finances and what should be spent in terms of remediation and so on, there's one thing for which there can be no doubt, which is that whether it's Grenfell for obvious reasons, but also all of hundreds of thousands of people like Sophie who are stuck in these places and whose lives have been, this is the thing that always struck me most when I was covering it, their lives are frozen. They're frozen. Imagine if you think about yourself.
Yeah, if you were thinking of having kids and you're still living in a one-bedroom flat that you can't move out of and you can't sell.
So imagine if you're listening to this and think, well, what house did you buy if you were lucky enough to do so a flat 7 years ago?
Yeah.
And maybe you're still in it, and that's great, but chances are you may have moved on with your life, and that is kind of the whole point of the housing market. These people, it's not just that they're stuck in a house, it's their lives are frozen. What there can be no doubt about for them and for Grenfell is that they have been the victims of a profound injustice. None of these people did anything wrong. There is not even like the slightest sort of hint of culpability. There's no caveat emptor. There's no buyers beware. Like, they bought these in good faith.
You weren't getting knockdown prices at the time.
No,
They're
indeed.
Paying top
that's
notch
the
anyway.
thing. And they're already
they're
paying
brand
through
new.
They're still paying for those mortgages.
Yeah.
They're paying huge amounts often for a property which basically, on some level, they're being told is unlivable and that they cannot sell. So there has been a profound injustice in every single way, and it does have to be addressed one way or the other. The last government tried to do it, didn't get there. One way or the other, this government is going to have to try and look at it.